things to tell you. One of them is that yesterday I got my stitches out, which was great. I was going to get them out Sunday, and then I found out that it was going to cost a lot more to go back to the urgent care clinic than it was going to cost to wait to go to my doctor's office on Wednesday. So I went to my doctor's office on Wednesday. You know, so many people, like Debbie said that. Debbie said, my skydiving instructor said that. Like everybody's like, I could have done it. And then I got to thinking, maybe I could have just done it. I don't know. So I got that done, but that meant that I could swim. So yesterday, after I went home last night and I was, watching the storms that were supposed to come in, I did what every good Oklahoman does and went outside and got in the pool. And I'm sitting there, and we had Megan and Chris come over. And Robin's there, and Kate's brother was there. Between like all the family, my sister has a shelter, I have a shelter, and Kate's mom has a shelter. So we divide people up, when there's storms. So we had everybody there, and they're like, yeah, of course we're going to swim. And so we're sitting there. And my house is a 2-story house, and there is a covering that comes out over like the patio right by the house where you walk out on the patio. And I have been looking at that for the better part of a year, wondering if that covering, because it's built very sturdily, is strong enough to support my weight, because it goes right up to the edge of the pool, right? And I was a sniper. There's no way I'm not jumping off the roof into the pool. So we're sitting there and swimming, and Chris is like, do you think we can do it? And I was like, yeah, I don't know. I don't know if we can do it. And he's like, we got to try. And by that point, I had been called out. So I was like, okay, we're going to try. So we did one of those don't try this at home things, went upstairs, went out the window, got on the roof, stood over the top. I've got video of this that I might try to show you in the next week or so. And so it turns out that at the ripe old age of almost 45, you can jump off your roof into the pool and survive, even when there is a tornado coming. I did it a total of 4 times and had just a blast. So it was great. I kind of did. I was trying to attract that, keep it away from you. You're welcome. That was what I was here for. So, but all joking aside, Seminole did get hit pretty hard last night. They took a real beating. So, I was talking to a friend this morning. I think there's going to be an opportunity to volunteer to go down there to help with cleanup in the next week or two. Maybe through a couple of different organizations. So as I get that information, I'll put it out to the congregation. I probably will try to go if I can figure out a way to get down there to do that. Also, today is National Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women Awareness Day, in addition to being Cinco de Mayo. We took care of the latter already. Kate's office is having a salsa contest, and since I make the world's best salsa, she asked me to make some, so I did. So if you could keep that in your prayers, I would love to win that contest. But we're going out after I'm done here. Megan and I are going out to the Capitol. There is a big MMIW awareness rally that happens out there every year. So, yeah, we're going to try to paint our faces. Hopefully, if we can locate the face paint. But yeah, we're going to try. So the symbol for MMIW, Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women, you can get on my Facebook page today and find all the stats. But Indigenous women are hurt, murdered, raped at much, much higher rates than in even other groups of women, which are at high rates. So a symbol for that has become a red hand painted over the face of a person. A lot of Indigenous people will sport that on days like today. There's a large MMIW organization here in the metro. This connects directly to what we're getting ready to do to try to speak out, against human trafficking and make a difference there. So I'm going to go down there, be a part of that rally for a little while today, and hopefully learn a few things that I don't know that I can bring back. But keep us in your prayers, and keep all the people in your prayers that we're supposed to be thinking about and being aware of today. That is a tremendous problem. All right, all those things said, we have a short chapter to study today. It's going to give us an opportunity, though, I think, to talk about a couple of important things. So we're in Genesis 13. I thought about taking us on into 14 today because it is a short chapter. But 14 is a pretty lengthy chapter, and there's a lot to talk about there. So we'll focus on that next week, and then the following week will be in Genesis 15. Let me go ahead and pray with you. The scriptures are holy, and before we consider them, we should pray. Let's do that, and then we'll get started. Almighty God, we're grateful for today. We are grateful for the rain. There has been so much of it and storms associated with it, but there are also so many years in which we have asked you for it. We don't want to neglect giving you thanks for the rain that's here because we do need it. We're also grateful, God, for our time together and for the opportunity to learn more about who you are and who you're calling us to be. As you have brought us together and helped us to grow individually, to grow as a community of faith, you have also guided us into mission in ways that I think few of us would have anticipated before you began to lead us. And you're continuing to lead us. And because your people here are being faithful, lives are being changed. And so, God, we want to lift up all of those with whom we have the chance to minister and serve wherever they may be. We also want to lift up those whom you will draw us into relationship and community with. Be with them where they are. Provide healing and rescue where it's needed. And give us the opportunity to learn what we don't know so that we can be a part of what you're already doing. Today, God, we ask that you would open our hearts and our minds and our spirits. Help us to learn today whatever we might need to learn in order to take one more step toward knowing you better and growing closer together to one another. And this we ask in your name. Amen. Boy, I thought the rain was going to be clearing up this morning. I guess that forecast has changed a little bit. Okay, so if you may have noticed that we have moved out of some of the ancient stories, what anthropologists will often call creation myths. And so because we've kind of moved out of some of those ancient creation stories, we've kind of moved into some of the specific stories that will begin to form the history of the people of Israel. And so we're kind of moving away from some of the stories that talk about some of the amazing things of the past that link up with other ancient stories from ancient Mesopotamia. We kind of moved out of a lot of that. And so the tone and the nature of the writing in Genesis has kind of changed a little bit. Now, instead of trying to co-opt the older creation mythology and retell those stories in the context of Hebrew theology, monotheistic theology, now we're kind of starting to get the history of God's work with the ancient Israelite people, or who will be the ancient Israelite people. And so because of that, we're getting a little bit of a narrative, and that narrative is kind of setting the foundation for the story that is going to be built. In particular, now that's beginning with Abram. So we've been introduced to Abram. We've seen the episode between Abram and his wife where he says that she is his sister, and as a result of that, probably survives their trip to Egypt after having left what would be the promised land for them because of severe famine. They go into Egypt. Abram probably would have been killed. Killing the husband, taking a desirable wife at that time was common practice. But the problem is that it comes across as a bit disingenuous. The scriptures, and by a bit I mean a lot, the scriptures don't really address that real well, probably for a lot of reasons, and we talked about some of that last week. Was that a fairly common practice? It was a known practice. We talked about that some last week, which is probably why Abram did it. Was it seen as something that was virtuous? That's less clear. Whether or not it was then, it certainly isn't seen that way today, particularly, and today being the result of much evolution of theology between the people's first encounter with God and what God has taught us in the intervening generations. And so that does not come, for most of us, that just doesn't sit well. It's going to happen again, too. But it also leads to Abram getting great wealth. But getting great wealth through means that are a bit duplicitous, but also the duplicity of the means is levied against a people that are outside of the promise at this time. And we see that, and we're going to see here too, that God's judgment in the Old Testament rests upon those who are outside of the promised people. While there's a little bit of a dichotomy that develops in the telling of the story. For instance, God is making a covenant with Abram and Abram's descendants, the people who will be Israel. I will be your God and you will be my people, right? But in spite of that, even though that's kind of what scholars would call the sanctity of God's presence, rests with the chosen people of Israel, at least at this point it does. And actually, that whole theology that we're going to develop here pretty soon over the next few chapters is a large part of what Paul is talking about in the book of Romans when he tries to make the case that the status as chosen people applies to theological descendants, not so much ethnic descendants. He makes a big, long case about that, saying then that the followers of Christ are legitimate heirs to the promise given to the people of Israel, because there's a theological issue there about how that promise is going to work itself out in the New Testament. So you're going to see the foundation of that theology kind of begin to develop here. But God is making covenant with Abraham. And so the sanctity of God's presence kind of rests with the chosen people, and that's how they're going to be referred to here for a little while. However, while the sanctity of God's presence kind of rests with the chosen people, the Old Testament gives us example of how God's power and authority applies to all people, and therefore God's judgment rests upon people even outside of the chosen people. For instance, like Sodom and Gomorrah, which we're about to read about in this chapter. This is not the passage where Sodom is destroyed, but we get a reference to that and the fact that it's coming in this chapter. You see the same thing with Egypt. Egypt is not particularly in God's favor. We're going to see that again later, right, in a pretty long story. And so while the sanctity of the presence of God in the Old Testament rests with the chosen people, and they are called that, they are the chosen people not specifically because they are God's people, but because they are the people through whom God has chosen to reestablish a connection with humanity through covenant, post-flood, right? So as a result of that, God is seeking to reestablish a connection with humanity. God does that covenantally, and God chooses to do that through the chosen people of Israel. And that's what they're chosen for. But God is also going to tell Abram that it is through his descendants that all of the world will be saved. So what you get is what is called a covenantal evolutionary theology. The way that God relates to us is through covenant, but that covenant evolves over time by God's design. And God tells us that that is going to happen. Jeremiah, I think it's Jeremiah 20, it's either Jeremiah 29 or 31, I can never remember which one it is. But it's when Jeremiah is prophesying that God is saying that there's going to be a time when I make a new covenant with my people. And the difference, God says, is that unlike the covenants of old, the law, instead of being written on paper, will be written on your heart, which is a metaphor for you will be able to, and God says this in a minute, you will not have to say to other people, you should know God, because they'll be able to know me directly. So that we get a foretaste or a little bit of a foreshadowing of what the structure of the new covenant is going to be. That helps us to understand the nature of the new covenant, but also to see that the evolution of God's covenant with humanity is going to evolve, and that is by God's design. God intended for that. So the covenant that God is establishing with Abram is a covenant with a couple of contexts. One is that it is specific to that time and place and people and the way in which God is going to reestablish God's relationship with humanity through a chosen people. But we also see God's prophesying, foreshadowing, that there will be, that covenant is going to evolve. It's through that covenant that all of creation will be saved. And so while this covenant now is with this people, though God's judgment and therefore authority rests on all people, that covenant's going to evolve over time to encompass all people. And that's important when we try to take a look at the covenantal theology that is going to be addressed in the next couple of chapters. So here is one of the first opportunities where we're going to see that God is going to make this promise to Abram. There is a passage that will come in which Abram goes outside and is told to look up at the stars in the sky. Your descendants will be as numerous as the stars in the sky. This precedes that, and in this instance, Abram is going to be told that his descendants will be as numerous as the grains of sand, and that is with those descendants that the covenant will be worked out. So we have a few things to take a look at here. Also, there are a couple of interesting Interesting bits of theology that come out of the fact that this reads differently in Hebrew, again. For instance, this is one of four, you don't get this in the translation. I read a lot about this, trying to figure it out. A lot of translators overlook this one word. It's pronounced na, right? It's just an N-A with an accent over it, but it's pronounced na. It gets translated to please. And it occurs several times in the Old Testament, but only 4 times when God is speaking to someone. And yet, in almost every translation, while it is clearly there in Hebrew, I should probably have brought that in to show it to you, it's not in most translations. And there's so much written about this. And it falls in the category of this, why on earth are people overlooking it? Nobody seems to have a good answer, except for one that I found that I agree with. There are scholars who believe that is left out of translations in order to keep it from sounding like God is asking, such that what God says comes across more as a command. And so when we get there, I'll talk you through that a little bit, but it occurs here, and it's an interesting occurrence. It only happens 4 times here in Exodus. I don't remember where the others are. Okay, so let's go through chapter 13. This is about Abram and Lot. Abram and Lot are uncle and nephew, right? So Lot's been traveling with Abram and Sarai, and they're coming, at this point in the story, they're leaving Egypt and going back into what is essentially the promised land, right? There's no mention of the fact, I believe, if I remember correctly, that the famine has come to an end. We're just supposed to believe, essentially, that it must have come to an end, which leads us to wonder a bit just exactly how long they were in Egypt. How long did Sarai or Sarah spend as Pharaoh's wife exactly? And so presumably the famine has come to an end. They're going to go back, and they're going to go back with great wealth. You're going to see a little bit of a dichotomy here in terms of how that wealth works out. Livestock is the most important aspect of wealth in this society because not only does it produce, but it is much more coveted than precious metals, for instance, which is what we're going to see. We're going to see that Abram has a wealth of precious metals. Lot has a wealth of tents, a lot of tents, but they both have a lot of livestock. So let's read through the story, and I'll share some things as we do that. Chapter 13. Abram went up from Egypt toward the arid southern plain with his wife, with everything he had, and with Lot. Now, and again, he's about to tell us, but he's wealthy, and he's gotten that wealth because of telling Pharaoh that Sarai was his sister. Abram was very wealthy in livestock. You see how that comes first? Silver and gold. That's intentional. Livestock is the most important thing. Abram traveled, making and breaking camp from the arid southern plain to Bethel, and to the sacred place there where he had first pitched his tent between Bethel and Ai. Remember, he built an altar there, right? Goes there, pitched his tent, builds an altar and worships. That is, to the place at which he had earlier built the altar. There he worshipped in the Lord's name. And so here, his scholars are going to write about this interaction that he's about to have with Lot and say that he's behaving differently than he was behaving in Egypt. That now maybe, here he's come back and he did what he had done before, right? Remember, one of the first thing Noah does when he gets off the ark is what? He worships, right? Abram builds an altar and worships, right? So you see that as part and parcel of who Abram is. And then there's this episode where Abram and Sarai have a famine. They go to Egypt. He says that Sarai is his sister and all that. Scholars don't like that, understandably. And then he comes back and, he's worshiping again. And things are going to be a little different in terms of how he interacts with Lot. Maybe, I read a lot about this, maybe this is a homecoming for him. Maybe he found his way home and he's a godly man again, et cetera, et cetera. That makes some sense if you're reading it from our moral perspective, from the moral perspective of our culture. But you got to account for the fact that it is entirely possible, and I think, in an examination of that historically, probably likely, that Abram didn't think he did anything wrong with telling Pharaoh that Sarai was his sister. Pharaoh didn't like that. But what you get theologically out of that is that God fulfills God's promise to Abram and curses anybody who curses Abram, right? Ends up cursing Pharaoh because Pharaoh's action cursed Abram. And that leads to an interesting theological discussion. We kind of delved into this last week, but the difference between sins that you are aware of and sins that you are not aware of. Do the sins that I am aware of matter more than the sins that I've committed that I am not aware of? The theology of the Old Testament, and we don't like that, right? Because if I'm not aware that I'm doing something wrong, I don't want to be held responsible for the punishment of that, right? A couple of things. One is forgiveness absolves us from responsibility or from the consequences of punishment anyway. That's what forgiveness is. But what you get out of the theology of sin here in the Old Testament, that is a little different than a lot of our evolved Christian understanding of that, is that the consequence of sin, as it's described in the Old Testament, has more to do with the action than the motive. When you read about sin in the Old Testament, in the ways it's described, more often than not, it is the fact that doing the thing had consequences that were bad. Whether or not you intended to do a bad thing is often irrelevant. It is the doing of the thing, right? For example, not that I'm saying this is a sin, it was a great time, right? But jumping off the roof resulted in some bruises, right? I mean, just did. I'm going to wear them proudly, and I'm going to enjoy every bit of them. But it resulted in some bruises, right? Was jumping off the roof a good idea or a bad idea? I don't know. We can debate that later. Whether it was a good idea or a bad idea, or whether somehow you would think that was morally inappropriate or whatever, I don't know, the action resulted in consequences. Does that make sense? That's how you see sin described in the Old Testament. In the New Testament, there's a New Testament theology about, and Christ talks about this a lot in the Sermon on the Mount. I talk about this, about how why you do what you do matters as much to God as what you do. That leads to the fact that intention matters. Why you're doing what you do matters. That will lead to a theology of morality that Paul is going to help to evolve. And that was the point. The intent of that was to help us, and that's why Paul explains it so much, was to help us to be able to understand that when we're trying to figure out how to honor God, our intention matters. If what we're doing, presuming we're not infringing upon the rights of somebody else, which Paul also says, if what we're doing, if we're trying to honor God, that matters to God. In a nutshell, through the argument about meat or sacred days of the week, that's what Paul is trying to say. And it's building on Jesus' Sermon on the Mount. Why you do what you do matters, particularly as you move into the New Covenant, because all of that whole explanation is in the context of Christ, and then later Paul, trying to help people to understand what the New Covenant looks like. Because they spent so much time in the Old Covenant, the New Covenant is different, they're trying to figure it out. Well, one of the things that's changed is that, like Jeremiah says, the law is going to be written on my heart, no longer in a series of codes, 613 of them, or 14, depending on how you look at them. That's not how the law is written anymore. And some of the laws have changed. Now, Christians struggle with this sometimes, even though it's the same Christians who struggle with this consider themselves biblical literalists. I've never been able to figure that out because it is in the Bible where the law changes, and so that's always confused me. For instance, you can eat things you couldn't eat before. People to whom salvation was not available, now it's available. That's Philip and the Ethiopian eunuch. Peter in the story of the animals being lowered down. You don't have the right to call unclean what God has made clean. There's example after example in Acts of the law changing. Well, that's confusing for people. If I've had to follow these rules, if there's been a specific process for atonement, and now all that's changing, I've got to figure out how to do what I was doing before. And if what you're telling me is it's not in black and white, what is it? Well, God said that through Jeremiah, that it's going to be on your heart, which means you have to get to know God, which you've heard me talk about 100 times. So that's what they're trying to work their way through. Well, the movement, the theological movement into motivation matters. Why you're doing what you're doing matters as well. When Jesus starts talking about that in the Sermon on the Mount, and then Paul later explains that in mostly Romans. The point of that, the impetus behind that is exactly what Paul's going to try to explain. As you're trying to live into the new covenant and you're trying to figure out what to do, how do you know what is good and what is right before you know how to hear the voice of God? Before you know how to relate to God through the risen Christ, which is what Hebrews is all about. While you're learning that, how do you figure out what to do? Because you can't go back to the law. That Paul makes this huge case about how the law is no longer in effect. You can't go back to it. So what do, right? They're going to say over and over again, they're going to give you a little rubric for it, and they're going to say some version of, so long as you're not infringing upon the rights of other people, which is what Paul means when he says, don't do anything that's going to make your brother or sister fall. Christians have interpreted that phrase over the years and generations to mean, Paul's statement, don't do anything that'll make your brother or sister fall, to mean that you can't do anything that disagrees with my morality. That is not what Paul meant there. That means don't infringe upon the rights of other people. Or summarized, don't be a jerk, right? So as long as you're not infringing upon the rights of other people, Paul says the rubric is this. If you believe that what you're doing honors God, then it does. In fact, he even says, if you think this behavior honors God and don't do it, you're dishonoring God. And so that brings up what is actually properly called moral relativism, which Christians kind of struggle with in spite of the fact that it's part and parcel to the New Testament, New Covenant theology, but it's also transitory. It's a theology that's transitory. The New Covenant is designed for you to know God, right? So a lot of us don't. A lot of us don't try, or we do try, or we don't think it's possible. Or I've talked about that with you 100 times before, but that's how the New Covenant is designed. That's what we're supposed to be doing. It's what the church originally did. The idea that I'm supposed to take this rubric, so long as I'm not infringing upon the rights of other people, then if I believe that what I'm doing is the best way to honor God, that it is the best way to, then that matters to God, right? That was supposed to be a transitional thing while I'm getting to know God, so that I can then go to God and say, hey, God, what do you want me to do? Now, people will argue this, right? And they'll say, well, how do you know that just because you went to God, that what you're hearing is actually God? What if God tells you to do something terrible? And there's history of that, right? People think God has said to do things that are horrible, and they're wrong. That's great. That's why the church, the early church, the ecclesia, the early church developed a practice for discernment. That's one of the biggest reasons we're in community. It's not the only reason, but it's one of the big ones, so that we check it against the Scriptures, the whole story of the Scriptures. We check what we're hearing from God against our spiritual advisor. As followers of Christ, we're supposed to have that. We're supposed to have a spiritual advisor, spiritual director, right? We also check that against our accountability group, which is our congregation, which means there is a difference between, me talking to God about something trivial. Couldn't figure out what to make last night, right? What should I make? And I'm going to have a conversation with God about that. Should I make chili or should I make bratwurst? I don't need to check that against my community. Maybe I do. Maybe if I check that against you, you'll be like, Matt, your bratwurst is not good at all. You need to make chili, right? I could. But there's a difference between that and I think that God is calling me to step into the mission of human trafficking, alleviating human trafficking. Yeah, for certain we're gonna check that. So there's a difference there, right? Some of which is experientially learned through some common sense and other things. So that's what you're getting. The reason I bring that up is that's the evolution of the theology of motivation. Why you do what you do matters. But that evolved from what I just taught you over time into a theology of you're going to be punished for your motivation that was underlying what you did. If why you do what you do, listen to this, if why you do what you do matters, then your motivation is something that can be assessed for the purpose of determining whether or not you deserve punishment. Now, does that mean that your motivation doesn't matter at all? No, but it's a very different concept than the kind of concept you're seeing in the Old Testament about sin. Did I know this was wrong, or did I not know this was wrong? Did I do it anyway? And our evolved, sometimes off-topic Christian version of that theology would focus on that. Did I know it was wrong, or did I not? Because if I didn't, this is where we'll go. If I didn't know it was wrong, I shouldn't be punished for it, right? Well, The theology of grace in the New Testament is that through forgiveness, you're not going to be punished for it anyway, you know. But the theology of sin, the original theology of sin that sometimes we miss is, that was irrelevant. Not you're thinking, no, it matters. If you're trying to do something wrong, if you're trying to do something evil, there's a problem with you. Yes, there is. The Bible is chock full of dealing with the issues of the human heart. But when you're talking about sin, the idea of sin is related to the action. The action is what had consequences. Whether or not it was a good idea or a bad idea for me to jump off the roof into the pool, I still have bruises. I would have bruises whether it was a good idea or whether it was a bad idea, whether I intended to or not intended to. That's how sin is seen. And so the impetus in the Old Testament is more so on identifying which actions have negative consequences and not doing those things because they have negative consequences, more so than it is on try to pick a good thing to do. And that's hard sometimes for Christians to wrap their mind around because a lot of our theology is motivational. You need to be trying to do the right thing. So long as you're trying to do the right thing, and a lot of that comes from Paul's statement. But it can cause us to take a look at sin in the Old Testament according to a different set of lenses. And that causes us to fail to interpret Abram and Sarai's experience in Egypt in the context of A, the world they lived in, and B, the covenant they had with God that had a different understanding of sin than what is probably naturally common for you and I as a Christian. So what that means here is this. Abram is not really exhibiting different character traits when he comes back. He's already the kind of person who is going to worship God first. We're looking at this and thinking, man, that was a terrible thing to do in Egypt. Why did he do that? But there's a good chance that he didn't feel that way about it. Pharaoh did, but we get an example here of Pharaoh, of God following through with the promise to curse whoever curses Abram. Whether he knew it or not was not relevant. He did something against Abram, and God is showing that God will be faithful in that. Now, don't take that too far, because part of what I'm teaching is an Old Testament concept of sin. The way that evolves in the New Testament is going to be a lot more like what you're struggling with or thinking about now. So don't think that as followers of Christ, our motivation doesn't matter in terms of if I'm trying to do an evil thing, that simply doesn't matter. That's not true. Christ is clear about that too. But we'll miss some of the lessons coming out of the Old Testament if we don't account for the differences between the two, which is why it's important to know, especially in a class setting. All right, here we go. So he's at Bethel. He's been worshiping. Verse 5, now Lot, who traveled with Abram, also get the livestock first, right? Flocks, cattle, and tents. So Abram had livestock and, what did it say, silver and gold. Lot has flocks, cattle, and tents. So a little bit different physical wealth, but they both have a lot of livestock. So they had so many possessions between them that the land could no longer support both of them. They could no longer live together. Conflicts broke out between those herding Abram's livestock and those herding Lot's livestock. At that time, the Canaanites and the Parasites lived in the land. So the Canaanites and Parasites, we don't like them, right? At least Abram and Lot don't like them. We probably would think they're fine. But Abram and Lot don't like them at all. Here's what you're getting out of this. One, this is one of the first examples of the Bedob splitting. Bedob is the Hebrew word for family or clan. It is the clan structure. It's the way that the patriarchal, patrilineal, and patrilocal family was structured. Oldest living patriarch is in charge of the Bedob, right? It's written B-E-T space A-B, but it's pronounced Bedob. So the Bedob here is going to split. Why? Because it's gotten too big. The Bedob has become too big for the land that they're on to be able to resource it. Just like every culture in human history, conflict breaks out when there is a lack of resources, right? So you're seeing that here. There is a lack of resources, and conflict has started to erupt. Now, that conflict has the potential to result in full-on violence, right? And so Abram sees that. And as the patriarch, Abram is the patriarch, right? Lot is not, and so as his nephew, Lot is supposed to be subservient to Abram. Abram is going to give Lot the chance to choose where to go. And Lot is going to choose the more fertile area, right? Scholars write about this. Ministers preach about this. And there are two really key important points here. One is Lot gets a bad rap for ostensibly being selfish. He should have given the better land to Abram, right? Well, maybe he should have. But the more fertile land that he chooses is right near where Sodom and Gomorrah are. He's with the Sodomites, and we're going to find that they are evil people that are later going to experience judgment. They're outside of the auspices of the Promised Land. Abram ends up in the Promised Land, which is a better choice, right? In spite of that, we're going to see a little bit of a dichotomy between Lot making a decision based upon what he sees and where he wants to go, and Abram making decisions based upon God's guidance. And we'll see that over and over again throughout the Scriptures. That works out worse for Lot. Strategically, though, Abram is doing a smart thing. If Lot is supposed to be subservient to Abram, they're already having conflict. That conflict has the potential to turn into violence. You all have been involved in community groups of various kinds for your whole lives. What do you think would happen if Abram assigned to Lot a parcel of land and it was the worst parcel of land, right? Over time, Lot's descendants, Lot's family members end up getting bitter, right? He gave us the worst part of land. We can't survive here, et cetera, et cetera. And that eventually could lead to conflict, to armed conflict. But by allowing him to choose, he gets to choose and he chooses what he believes is the better piece of land. Probably not completely selfish. It's just a good logical choice, right? But it's also outside of the auspices of the promise. So he chooses what seems to be the better land. Going there was now his choice. He wasn't assigned it by Abram. It's not a worse parcel of land. He got the better deal out of it. If there's conflict later, and there will be, but not between them that way, then that's not the result of bitterness related to Abram. So Abram's got a good read on human nature and makes a pretty strategically sound decision. All right, so the other thing is that the Canaanites and the Parasites are there. Obviously, they're sharing resources and land with the Canaanites and the Parasites, right? And seem to be getting along better with them than they are with one another. If I were going to preach about that, I would talk about the propensity that we have to have the most conflict in life with the people who are closest to us. I'm not going to preach too much, but there are two reasons for that, I believe. Probably more, but two important ones. One is we spend more time with them. We all learned that in the quarantine, right, in the pandemic. We spend more time with them. But the other is we tend to treat the people we're closest with worse than we treat other people because we feel safer with them. It's not so much just familiarity. It's feeling safe. And if we're not careful, we end up creating far more discord with those people than we do with other people because instead of treating them better, we end up treating them worse. Conceivably, we should treat the people we love the most the best. Maybe as Christians, we should treat everybody with a great deal of love. I don't know. But when we tend to treat the people it's human nature, to treat the people closest to us worse, there's no way that doesn't result in conflict, discord, hurt, anger, upset, bitterness, right? Which is part of why forgiving the people closest to you is such a difficult thing to do. So they're able to get along with the Canaanites and the Parasites, but not with one another. Verse 8, Abram said to Lot, let's not have disputes between me and you and between our herders since we're relatives. Isn't the whole land in front of you? Let's separate. If you go north, I will go south. If you go south, I will go north. Lot looked up and saw the entire Jordan Valley. All of it was well irrigated. So there's a and you should look for this. Now that I'm sharing it with you, look for it in the Scriptures. There's a sequence here that is common. It is to see and then act. God saw that the people of the earth had only evil in their hearts all the time and then acted, right? There's several instances of that leading up to this. And the word, I'm going to have to read it, is ra'aki, that is translated to look, ra'aki, which means to observe, but to observe and like in the context of understand. Like to be savvy is probably not the right word. To see, be aware, to be able to read the room, to be able to figure out to understand the context of what you're seeing. So when you see here that he looked up, it's not like he looked up and saw it. He looked up, read the room, and figured out what was before him and made a decision based on that. There is over and over and over, Eve does this. She saw the fruit and decided to eat the fruit. We're going to see repeatedly that there is a difference with humans between when we choose to make assessments ourselves and act based upon those assessments, which Lot will make, and it will turn out badly for him eventually, versus when we choose to follow the leading of the Holy Spirit, which is the alternative that we're given here in the Scriptures, and that's what Abram is going to end up doing. All right, so let's separate. Lot looked up, saw the entire Jordan Valley, all of it was irrigated, like the garden of the Lord, which is Eden, like the land of Egypt as far as Zoar, so that's most likely the fertile delta region of Egypt. This was before the Lord had destroyed Sodom and Gomorrah. So that's where he's going, right? That's where he's going to be going to settle, is right there in and near Sodom and Gomorrah. So Lot chose for himself the entire Jordan Valley. Lot set out toward the east, and they separated from each other. Abram settled in the land of Canaan, and Lot settled near the cities of the valley and pitched his tent close to Sodom. The citizens of Sodom were very evil and sinful against the Lord. So he's going to a place. One of the things that I will teach about from time to time is that there are three things that will affect what you believe and who you are more than you give them credit for. There's a lot of things that affect who you are and what you believe, but I think there are three things that do that more than we give them credit for. One is the visual media that you choose to consume, be that on a phone screen, on Netflix, and I'm not one who believes that's bad. Binge watching things is one of my favorite pastimes, right? Comedy, stand-up comedy on TikTok is how I put myself to sleep at night. So I don't think that's a bad thing. But the visual media you consume has more to do with what you believe, what we believe, than we give it credit for. The other is the music we listen to. Now, well, let me back up, because, no, I'll get there in a minute. So the other is music. The music you listen to has more to do with what you think and what you believe than you give it credit for. But the other is the people that you choose to be around. The people that you choose to be around have a far greater influence on what you think and what you believe and whom you choose to be than we often give them credit for. Because humans are naturally communal people. It's kind of, no matter how individualistic any of us thinks we are, we have an internal desire to be loved and accepted by other people. And we will modify our behaviors, at least to a degree, to fit in with the group that we're in. That's why many people in the same region are going to wear clothing that is similar to one another, etc. So it affects who we are more than we give it credit for. Why does that matter? Lot is voluntarily setting himself in the presence of people who are, as described by the Scriptures, evil and sinful against the Lord, right? So there's no way that to be in the presence of that, in this case evil, and not have that rub off on you, not have that affect more of you than you give it credit for. People will say, yeah, but whenever I go, I'm protected by God. I totally believe that. But you're also foolish if you don't think that who you're around affects you more than you're giving it credit for. That's worth thinking about, and it's going to do the same thing to Lot. All right, after Lot separated from him, I was going to go back to this. People will often bring up books. When I teach that, they'll say, I think books affect you, what you read affects you more than you give it credit for. And I will say that is a great answer. And the fact that you brought it up is why I never teach that, because you already know exactly how much what you read affects what you think. That's something, so does it? Yes. But I don't think it falls into the category of affecting what you think more than you give it credit for, which is why I never teach it that way, incidentally. Just wanted to throw that out there. Okay, so after Lot separated from him, the Lord said to Abram, from the place where you are standing, look up and gaze to the north. Does anybody have anything, is there anything, do you have a different version of that inserts any word before look up? From the place where you're standing, look up and gaze north, or look to the north, the south, east, and west. Is that essentially how yours reads without like a lot of variation? Probably, I would imagine. This is verse, wow, I should know this. 14, thank you. I doubt it. I mean, it probably has some version of that, right? The thing is that the word na precedes look, and that's what's often not translated. So when you read this in Hebrew, I'm going to insert that here, it would look like this. From the place where you're standing, please look up and gaze north, south, east, and west. Still comes across as a command, I guess, but it's a nice command. I mean, and it's an interest. It is, yeah. It's a nice way of saying do something. So it's interesting that it's so often pulled out so that Christians would not, and this is what most scholars will say, so that Christians will not have the impression that God is asking because God is commanding. I don't know. For starters, I would like to have the more accurate representation in there so that I can, form my own opinions about God's work in saving history. But beyond that, I like the fact that God is like, hey, would you, please look up here. I say that to people too. It's just a nice way to do that. And so it also illustrates a difference in how we see God. Because there is a difference between, God is who God is, right? And God is going to be who God is. But Christians all have varying perceptions of that or beliefs about that based on their level of interaction with God. And so there are plenty of Christians who see God as a directive, almost a militant overseer. Somebody who is going to smite thee if you happen to do anything for the wrong reason. Or even if you don't do anything for the wrong reason, just do the wrong to God, God will smite thee, right? Ranging from that to, God kind of envisioned as a grandfather, grandmother figure who's going to sit there with you and ask you questions that help you figure out the answer that God knows you're already being led to. Now, full disclosure, you don't know this about me, but my vision of God tends to fall on that side of things, right? Because my experience of God is very much that. But you see that there's a difference there in how God is presented. Gracious. I feel like that means either the Holy Spirit thinks I'm right or wrong. I'm not sure which way that's going. But there's a difference there in how God is presented, and I think that makes a difference, because especially if I'm reading this the first time with zero context. I think that kind of thing matters. But at any rate, the word is there. So from the place where you're going, from the place where you're standing, please, or would you please, look up, gaze to the north, south, east, and west, because all the land that you see, I will give you and your descendants forever. This is where this is the beginning of that covenant and the promise that it will endure, right? It's called a land grant. In terms of the second millennia Hittite, suzerain, vassal treaties, it falls in the category of what's called a land grant. The suzerain, which is a king, suzerain means more powerful party, ruler. Vassal is a state in subjugation, group of people in subjugation to a more powerful country or more powerful ruler. So the suzerain often will give a land grant. If you swear fealty to me, I will give you land. And that's what you're seeing here. It falls right in line with how those covenants are made. I'll give you descendants forever. I will make your descendants like the dust of the earth. If someone could count the bits of dust on the earth, then they could also count your descendants. That's obvious. Stand up and walk around through the length and breadth of the land, because I am giving it to you. Every time I read this, I think of the Lion King scene where Mufasa is standing there explaining, the boundaries of the realm that he's going to give to Simba. Because I'm giving it to you. So Abram packed his tent and went and settled by the oaks of Mamre and Hebron. There he built an altar to the Lord. So here he's doing exactly what he had been doing before. We're going to move into next week Abraham's rescue of Lot, which is our first real opportunity to talk about the nature of what the word redeem means and its biblical conception. When we talk about being redeemed, we normally use that in a very specific context. Have been redeemed by God, been redeemed by Christ, which is a great way to use it. I wouldn't change that. The thing is that the biblical concept of redemption has more to do with the responsibility of the one who has to redeem than it does with the one who is being redeemed. If you are the one, and there's the specific responsibility has to do with authority and power. So and we'll talk some about this next week, but in the ancient Israelite, or what will be Israelite culture, again, remember, it's patriarchal, patrilineal, patrilocal. Oldest living male is responsible. The oldest living male son gets a double portion of the inheritance because he will take over the Beidab. So he has to have the resources to provide for the Beidab. But while he has authority, the patriarch does, he also has responsibility to redeem anyone who is lost. This is the very reason that Christ gives an example about leaving the flock of sheep, leaving the 99 to go search for the one. That is a biblical concept of redemption, and it is related, not entirely, much more related to the one with the responsibility to redeem versus the one who can't redeem. If you are the person in the Beidab with less power, you do not have a responsibility to redeem. You must be redeemed because you have not the resources to do that. Abram is going to take, I'll have to read it again, I think it's like 400 people or something to go rescue Lot. Because as the patriarch, if something happens to Lot, which is about to happen, Abram has responsibility to go redeem him. Not responsibility in the context that you and I think of it, but think of it like military mission. He has no choice. He has to go redeem Lot. And we're meant to make that connection to what God does through Christ to redeem humanity. It is God, because Christ makes that connection over and over again by giving examples of the Beidab and inheritance in all of his teachings. But what you're supposed to be connecting out of those two things in New Testament theology, each time Christ talks about it, is that A, I can't redeem myself. That's not possible. I don't have the resources or the power or the authority to do that, right? In this case, I'm Lot. I am the lower ranking party in this covenant. I can't do it, right? And no matter how much I want to, I can't, which is why a theology of works-based righteousness fails. It doesn't fail because it doesn't make any sense. It fails because it isn't possible. That's why. I can't redeem myself. It is impossible for me to do what is necessary to put myself into right relationship with God. Now, just like any other relationship, the fact that Lot can't redeem himself doesn't mean he has no decisions to make. It doesn't mean he has no authority in any part of his life. It doesn't mean he doesn't make decisions about his actions. He does all those things. He just can't redeem himself, right? Same thing applies to God's, and you can see this almost as what is called type and typology, which is something explained on a smaller scale that is meant to help you understand something on a larger scale. So when we see this episode with the redemption of Lot and begin to understand what biblical redemption is, that is meant to help us understand what it is to be redeemed by God. I cannot do anything. I'm completely reliant upon God's not only grace and mercy, but also God's power and authority to redeem me from an undesirable place. So we'll talk about that some next week. If you want to read ahead, read through 14. We will not do 15 next week. 15 is another pretty powerful passage that there will be a lot to talk about in, so we'll do that the following week. All right, my friends, I'm going to take a minute. Well, we have about 5 minutes. Do you have any questions or thoughts before I pray for you? Yes, sir. Right. That is a good, yeah. For those of you who are watching, so there's a saying that ignorance of the law is not a valid excuse for breaking the law. We get it in that context, right? If I didn't know that I broke a law, I still broke the law. Still subject, yeah, to the auspices of whatever the law says. Which is part of, and that's a good way to understand, I think, Old Testament concept of sin. It's also part of the reason why forgiveness matters so much. You probably have heard me say this a couple of times. I've said it twice, I think, in the last 4 to 6 weeks, because it's something. Yes. Yes, and large part, even if and there are consequences to that action that go beyond the corrective punishment too, right? If I'm going 100 miles an hour down Penn, there's a strong possibility that I'm going to cause damage or injury or something like that. And that's beyond the punishment that would be associated with it. Punishment is an important part of that. There's a difference between the natural, I'm going to say this kind of carefully, the natural course of events that come from taking an action and being held accountable for that action. Here's what I mean by that. If no matter what let me use the jumping off the roof analogy again. From the minute I take the leap, I'm going to go down. I'm going to go into I'm not going to be able to stop that, turn it around. There are a series of events that are going to take place from the minute I take that action. Whether or not I want them to by that point is somewhat irrelevant, because I haven't figured out a way to stop myself midair, right? So that's going to happen. There's a difference between that and if that action also warrants some kind of punishment according to a law or the law. That's a good example, right? I have bruises, really proud of them, but that was going to happen. Right, right. So the bruises, none of that. It's not against the law, but there are. We like to say consequences, and that's probably true. But there's simply a series of events that are going to take place after a decision is made. That's just that's the nature of time and how decisions work. Sometimes we struggle to separate that from being punished for breaking a law by the decision that you make, right? So here's where forgiveness comes in. You've heard me say that when no one has the right to hold you accountable for something which God has forgiven you for, that is forgiveness. Anything else is not. So a lot of the time we'll say, well, I'll forgive you, but there are consequences for your actions. If we said that in the context of, once you jump off the roof, you're going to fall in the water. Once you fall in the water, you're going to get bruises. Yeah, well, yeah. But most of the time, we use that in the context of an excuse to punish you anyway. And that is not forgiveness. Well, yeah, I forgive you, but there's still consequences. And those consequences are I'm going to punish you. No. But so when we're using it that way, we're going against the concept of forgiveness, right? And in particular, and this is important. If you're a follower of Christ, I'm a follower of Christ, and that person has gone to the Lord to seek forgiveness, then guess who it was that granted it? People will sometimes say, well, God may have forgiven you, but I didn't. Okay, well, if God has forgiven somebody, God is the one who has more power and authority to do that than I do. I don't have the right to punish you for something that God has forgiven you for. I simply don't. If I do that, I am now. Let me start here. If I do that, I'm taking an authority I don't have, and that actually is a sin of commission. And then we'll say, well, yeah, but then what we'll struggle with is this, and let me just say it directly. What we'll struggle with is I'm still hurting because of something, right? I'm still hurting. I'm still angry. All of which is valid. All of that is valid. The difference is that forgiveness means the pound of flesh that is deserved is not going to be extracted. So is it valid that I'm still angry? Absolutely it is. Is it valid that I am still hurting? Absolutely it is. In the healthiest of worlds, my focus is going to be on healing how I'm feeling about that without further harming somebody in order for me to be able to heal, right? Which is part and parcel of the concept of revenge versus punishment. If I think I need you to hurt in order for me to heal, that is not punishment, that's revenge. And so we struggle with that, right? Well, then the question I have is, well, how can I heal if this person is not held accountable? How can I heal if I don't hold this person accountable? Gosh, that's a great conversation to have that I'm going to have to wrap up really fast. Let me say it this way. Revenge has yet to heal. In the long history of humanity, revenge has yet to heal. The guy that drove into Jake and killed him in 2016, who was on drugs at the time, he was held accountable. And at the end of that process, ended up not making any of us feel better. We still healed and are healing from the grief and loss that come from Jake having to die that way. Flew out of a window as the car flipped, choked on his own blood in a ditch while his brother held him in his arms. It was terrible. And the guy was held accountable. It was hard. Eventually he was held accountable, right? That didn't end up making any of us, we've talked about it 100 times, didn't help us feel better. Now, somebody will always say to me in this, yeah, but there have to be laws. You know, there's a difference between the running of a society and yours and my ability to forgive as followers of Christ. Those are two different things. Where those things intersect are when someone has done something that's hurtful and is seeking forgiveness. There's story after story, and it's hard to process, but there's story after story that ends in the Scriptures that ends with something like, yes, forgive because I've been forgiven, which is an issue of fairness. If I've been forgiven, it's unfair for me to not forgive. Hard, yes, but hard and fair are not the same thing. The other is health. It is also, story after story, unhealthy for me not to forgive. And it is not unhealthy for the person I am not forgiving. It is unhealthy for me to continue to carry that bitterness. So sometime, I'll dig into forgiveness in detail in a sermon at some point and talk about that, because there's a lot to process there. You know, if I'm hurting, if I'm angry, those are legitimate feelings. But there are good ways to work through that encompass forgiveness as a part of that healing journey, right? But that's going to take longer than I have today, so I'm going to wrap that up. I'll dig into forgiveness sometime in the near future, though. All right, it's 11:34. Let me go ahead and pray for you all, and then we'll take our chances with the rain. God, thank you for today, and thank you for the opportunity to be here to learn a little bit more about what you have done and about who and what you're calling us to be and to live into. God, there will be those of us wherever and whenever we are who are struggling with varying things, particularly because we have started to talk about something like forgiveness. That can be so hard. Forgiveness and bitterness can be so hard to process, especially when we're grieving, especially when we're hurting, especially when we're angry. And so God, if as we've talked today, I just want to pray specifically for those people who are grieving, who are hurting, who are angry over whatever might come up or have come up. I pray that your Holy Spirit would be there. I pray that your Holy Spirit would help all of us in whatever capacity is necessary to be able to rest in your healing presence. And when we are ready, when you know that we are ready, when we know together with you and in you that we're ready to be able to take a step toward healing in a healthy way, because we know, God, that is where you will lead us. That if we follow you, you're going to lead us to health and to healing, even if sometimes that journey is difficult, and even if sometimes that journey is lengthy. But you've also promised us that you will not abandon us on that journey, and that when it is too difficult, you will carry us. Be with us today in your name. Amen. Thank you all for coming.